Hi, this is Mike from Mike's Unboxing Reviews and How To, and on today's video we'll take a look at the RTX 3070 Founders Edition, a card which was somewhat controversial on its initial release way back in the September of 2020 and is actually available for retail release October 29th, 2020. And if you can remember that far back, you'll remember that those were the days of the extreme GPU shortages. So it was one of those cards where people were desperate to get hold of it, and I think in certain regions, such as Canada, there was like 10 in the country or something ridiculous. It was bad times. Fortunately, things have got slightly better. Prices definitely haven't, but in terms of general availability, there are more GPUs on the market and lots more choice. So if you're in 2024 and you have somewhere in the region of about £250 to £300 to spend, is the RTX 3070 worth getting? And if you, like me, prefer to play your games and use your computer at a higher resolution, 1440p, 4K, is it going to cut the mustard? Will you be able to play your games? Is it going to be fun times all round? Well, in today's video, we're going to go through, talk about some of the specs of this card, some of the history of it, and also we're taking a look at some of my favourite games and see what the results are like at 4K at a mixture of medium and high settings. And hopefully by the end of the video, if you can find one of these cards on the market for a sensible price, then potentially you might want to jump on it. Now, I actually picked this one up from a good friend of the channel, Dave Aitken. Thank you very much, Dave. And I actually paid £250 for this, which seems to be on eBay and places like that here in the UK, a reasonably good price. So I feel I got a pretty good bargain, although I have seen them on the market for as much as 300 plus, at which point I think you really do have to consider other options. So let's take a look at the actual architecture of this. So it is based on the Ampere architecture, which was released in 2020, and has other models in the range of the 3000 series, such as the 3060, the 3070, 3080, and of course the 3090. The 3060 Ti came out a little bit later, about a year later in fact, and is actually a pretty good substitute for the 3070 in general, due to the fact it having almost identical specifications. The Ampere architecture consisted of the second generation ray tracing cores, third generation tensor cores. Of course, DLSS was gaining momentum as we went through. This card is slightly limited by its 8GB VRAM and its 256-bit bus, which was actually complained about at the product launch. We're looking at somewhere around about 448 gigabits per second on the RAM, base clocks of 1500 MHz, boost clocks of 1725, and quite often it does go considerably above that. We've got 5,888 CUDA cores, or shading units, depending on how you want to look at it. You've got 184 TMUs and 96 ROPs. Along with this, we've got 46 ray tracing cores and a TDP of 220 watts and a recommendation of a 550 watt power supply. So let's rewind a little bit and look at some of the controversy at the time. So NVIDIA released this card and basically tried to screw over all the other manufacturers by releasing a day early and also limiting what others could do in terms of releases and also clock speeds and all that kind of stuff. Something which was a major controversy at the time was the 12-pin power connector, which is now the 12+4. So that's got slightly better, I feel, but at its time, the 12-pin power connector was kind of touted as being a pointless decision, put in a very awkward place, slap bang in the middle of the card, and also for cards such as the 3060 Ti and also the 3070, because you only needed one 8-pin power connector, you were basically changing something which you already had into something which was seemingly pointless. Now, I personally actually don't mind the 12-pin power connector, and with an adapter lead such as the one here, which was actually sent to us by Dave Aitken, which I've been using with my 3060 Ti and also now the 3070, I think it actually looks really nice. Some of the other controversy at the time was the fact that NVIDIA were actually touting this as a replacement or a kind of competitor with the RTX 2080 Ti. And some of the benchmarks which were shown during the release were somewhat favouring the 3070, but using things such as DLSS and other technologies due to make the frame rate seem a little bit faster, but kind of almost fudging the numbers. Now, after this release, there was other reviews, and in general, people found that it wasn't entirely as fast as the 2080 Ti. In some instances, it was about the same or a little bit faster, and in some instances, it was considerably slower due to the 2080 Ti's significantly better memory bus. But overall, it was one of those cards where at the time, if you wanted it and you had that sort of money, it was pretty much all you could get on the market. And of course, AMD 6000 series at the time was pretty good, but still wasn't that close a competitor. So with all that said, let's take a look and see what this card actually performs like in my system. I did initially have some issues where I was previously using a RTX 3060 Ti, and I just took that card out, put the RTX 3070 straight in, didn't change the drivers, didn't do anything, and it was behaving a little bit weirdly. Fortunately, I did do a DDU, and if you're not sure what a DDU is, it's a display driver uninstallation utility, which I strongly suggest you do when you switch out any graphics card. I should have learned from my own mistakes there, but I didn't, unfortunately. Anyway, that's enough said. Let's take a look at some of these games. Okay, so first of all, we'll start off with Time Spy, just to have a little bit of a sanity check to see if we're performing as we should. And actually, this has been paired with the Ryzen 7 7700, and it seems to be a pretty good match. If we look at our graphics score, we've got 13,359 points, and the CPU score, we've got 13,126. So pretty even match there. That gave us an overall Time Spy score of 13,323, and Time Spy said this was a good score, which I kind of agree with. Next up, we've got CS2. So this actually runs really nicely on most hardware. Now this is running at 4K. We've got the medium preset here, and we're getting an average frame rate, 365.2 FPS, a minimum frame rate of 193.7, maximum frame rate of 571.7, 1% lows of 138.8, and a quite abysmal 0.1% low frame rate of 28.2. There was the occasional stutter here, which I'm sure was down to the drivers, but in general it was a very playable experience and it looked fantastic at 4K. Next up, we've got Cyberpunk 2077. Again, this is at the 4K medium preset. Ray tracing is disabled for this. So we've got an average frame rate here of 62.7 FPS, a minimum frame rate 57.6, maximum of 67.8, 1% lows 51.8, and a 0.1% low frame rate of 39.5. So actually a very consistent experience, even though this game is known to tax most cards. I enjoyed it, it looks really nice, and again, 4K Cyberpunk, there's not a lot more you can ask for, especially for a relatively budget card. Next up, we'll take a look at something a little bit older here. So this is Dying Light, the first version. This is quite an old game now. So this was tested at 4K maximum settings with NVidia PCSS enabled. So this is basically all the eye candy you can possibly get. And with that, we still managed to get an average frame rate of 87.7, a minimum frame rate of 58.3, a maximum frame rate of 109.0, 1% lows of 61 FPS, and a 0.1% low of 51.3. Again, very consistent, which is actually unusual because this game is one of those where there's lots of things going on at times, and it can get very, very cluttered on the screen, which normally dips your frame rates. But here, as you can see, it's remained pretty consistent and very enjoyable and playable. Next up, something for you esports fans. Now, really, esports people won't be playing this at 4K, but what the heck. So this is 4K resolution with everything cranked up, and now we're getting an average frame rate of 212.7 FPS, minimum frame rate of 19.5, maximum frame rate 278.9, 1% lows of 68, and a 0.1% of 10. Now again, there are some very odd stutters going on here, which I do attribute to me not cleaning the drivers correctly. I may have to rerun this, but still, from the average frame rates you can see it's an extremely playable experience, even at 4K. Next we've got War Thunder. Again, this is 4K and this is at the medium preset. We've got an average frame rate of 185.3, minimums of 147.5, maximum frame rate of 223.4, 1% lows of 106.6, and a 0.1% low of 24.3. Again, the occasional stutter there, overall averaging 185 FPS at 4K medium settings, I still feel is very playable indeed. Next up, we've got Wreckfest. So this is being played at 4K. This is with the Ultra preset, and at which point we're getting an average frame rate of 98.1, minimum frame rate 59.4, so almost at 60 FPS there, maximum frame rate 134.1, 1% lows of 61.9, 0.1% lows of 58.4. This was actually really stable, very steady, and again, this is one of those games where if there's a lot of foliage or a lot of things going on, a lot of crashing going on, lots of physics on screen, it can really tank the performance, but here it's remained stable and around 60 FPS at a minimum all the way through, even at 4K Ultra. Next, we're going to take a look at Far Cry 6. So this is 4K medium settings, average frame rate here 70.7, minimums of 60.2, maximum 82.9, 1% lows of 55.7, and 0.1% lows of 42 FPS. Again, at 4K, this is to be expected. There will be those odd dips, especially when there's a lot of foliage, as there tends to be in this game at certain points, depending where you are, and also with those larger explosions almost filling the entire screen, you can expect to have those significant frame drops. But here, even at 4K medium settings, it seems to have maintained some pretty decent consistency, and overall was a very playable experience and looks absolutely gorgeous. Next, we've got Dead Island 2. This is another one of those games where there can be those occasional stutters, especially when there's a lot of stuff going on the screen. And there is also the built-in thing into the engine where if you do have kind of like a monster kill, it slows the frame rate right down to show you the gory detail. This is being played at 4K medium settings again, so we're looking at average frame rate 103.9, minimums 73.8, maximum frame rate 122.1, 1% lows of 46.8, and a 0.1% low frame rate of 8.6. So yeah, we did have a little stutter going on there, but it doesn't seem to have affected the average very much. Still was really playable and looks great at 4K. Next up, we've got Fortnite. This is also at 4K medium settings, and we've got an average frame rate here, 109.6, minimums of 84.4, maximum frame rate of 128.6, 1% lows, 48.2, and we get that stutter again, although that is really common in Fortnite for some reason. I don't know why it does it, just every now and then it just stutters like mad. And we've got a 0.1% low of 19.6. Overall, as you can see from the gameplay there, seemed actually very smooth. I didn't really notice those stutters as much as they are reporting. It looks very nice, very enjoyable game, and it is constantly evolving, so it's actually hard to benchmark this against other cards that I've used before because the game just changes so often. But still very enjoyable, very playable at 4K medium settings. And last up, we've got Flight Simulator 2020 from Microsoft, and this again, 4K medium settings or medium preset. So here we've got an average frame rate of 97.1 FPS, minimum frame rate of 83.2, a maximum frame rate of 110.5, 1% lows just over 60 FPS at 66.5, and our 0.1% low frame rate at 36.7. This again is one of those games which can tax the system. We did have DLSS enabled here, but it doesn't seem to have made a great deal of difference. I really couldn't tell. It still looks absolutely great. The scenery in this game is fantastic and can cause those occasional frame rate dips, but here it's remained actually relatively consistent considering what we're doing and the nature of the map itself and the skyline, shading, etc, etc. Very playable, very enjoyable, so if FS 2020 is your thing, the RTX 3070 at 4K or less is going to be a great experience. So there you go, that has been my experience with the RTX 4070 Founders Edition. Please do let me know in the comment section what your experience has been. Have you got this card, or maybe you're planning to splash out some cash and get one for an upgrade from a previous card, maybe a 3060 or something a little bit older, maybe a 2060, 2070. Is it worth doing? That is the question these days. The kind of middle ground between the sort of £250 and £300 mark for graphics cards at the moment is quite a murky area, and the decision is kind of, do you go brand new with something like a 3060 12 gig, or do you go with a used 3070? They are very much similar in pricing. Or do you look for something a little bit slower and possibly cheaper, RX 6700, Or do you spend a little bit of money, go up to the maybe 350, 370 mark and go for something like the RX 6800 16 gig, which is going to last a little bit longer in terms of the extra memory and does appear to be somewhere in the region about 20% faster or more in some titles. So sometimes it might be worth investing that little bit of extra cash, but ultimately, where do you stop? A little bit more money always gets you a little bit further up the ladder. But anyway, let me know what you think about this one in the comments section below. Thanks again to Dave Aiken for sending this graphics card over to us and let me test it before I actually pay for it, which is always a good thing. So hopefully you've enjoyed this video. If you have, smash the like button. If you want to see more content like this on a daily basis, maybe consider hitting subscribe and the chime notification. That way you'll be notified of future video releases. But for now, I've been Mike. This is Mike's Unboxing Reviews and How To, and hopefully we'll catch you in the very next video. Thanks for watching.